mean that for nearly 3,000 years, man has been searching for the lost ark. Not something to be taken lightly. No one knows its secrets. It's like nothing you've ever gone after before.
Oh, Marcus, what are you trying to do? Scare me? You sound like my mother. We've known each other for a long time. I don't believe in magic, a lot of superstitious hocus pocus. I'm going after a find of incredible historical significance. You're talking about the boogeyman. Besides, you know what a cautious fellow I am.
Hello and welcome once again. I hope you're well, wherever you are. Gurdjieff once talked about a higher evolution of the moving center. Very interesting. And he said something about the desecration of tombs by modern people. And I will revisit something about modern building projects. Now, I happened to see a couple of weeks ago that the relics, meaning the preserved body of Mary Magdalene, had been opened up and some Hasnamussian scientists were probing it for something, and that the Catholic Church had allowed this utter desecration of its holiest relics, which was shocking to me. But I remember that Gurdjieff had written, "Well, my boy, according to the research and investigations of one of our countrymen, who exists there to this day, and about which I was informed by etherogram after my final departure from your planet, it appears that just when a process of reciprocal destruction began between the beings of this Egypt and those of a neighbouring community, the existence of one of their pharaohs came to an end. Now the beings whose business it was to preserve forever the bodies of meritorious beings were unable, owing to the approach of their enemies, to keep the planetary body of this pharaoh in castor oil as long as was necessary, that is, for half a month. Nevertheless, they put this body into castor oil, then placed it in a hermetically sealed chamber, and having dissolved the aforesaid sacred substance force in a certain way, they introduced it into the chamber also, in order to obtain the desired results. It transpired that this sacred force, effectively accomplishing what they had expected, was preserved in this hermetically sealed chamber, and, as always takes place from the action of what are called catalysts, remained in its integral state until quite recently. This sacred something would have remained in its pristine state for untold centuries among these three-brained beings who long ago ceased to have any reverence in their essence. But since, in the presences of these contemporary unconscious desecrators, a criminal passion has arisen, evoking in them a need to despoil even the sanctuaries of beings of past generations, they dug down into this chamber, which ought to have been for them a profoundly revered sanctuary, and thus they committed that sacrilege, the result of which caused me to become aware with the whole of my being of my mistake. The mistake I made when I so confidently assured you that nothing whatever had reached the beings of contemporary civilizations from the beings of long past epochs. For this event, which had recently occurred in Egypt, is indeed a consequence of the results attained by those ancient ancestors of theirs who used to exist on the continent of Atlantis. It's also evident to me that the fashion that politicians have these days of condemning people in the past, people say in British India or in the colonial times, stems from the fact that they're not around to answer. They're not around to explain the facts of life back then. And it's for that reason that this business of taking a cheap shot at those who are long dead is now so popular. At the end here, Gurdjieff says that nothing has reached the beings from ancient times. And our lives here are very strange because things just carry on. And you could forget all about the Gurdjieff work, just like everybody else on this planet. Nevertheless, objectively speaking, the life of human beings is shocking. It is shocking. And they don't know that it's shocking because they don't know very much at all. Society today seems to work with each person being taught robotically just a small function, and that's all that they can do. Something goes in, something goes out mechanically. Nearly all human beings are like that, and in long chains they manage to make society go around. But the vibrant, open, living soul is no longer present, or only quite rarely. Last week I talked about some of the architecture from British India. I hadn't planned on going back there, but I did see this video of what it's like today.
Look at these places, the old British buildings. Look at them now overgrown, just left to rot. Look, literal plants growing through the windows, abandoned.
Of course, in 1947, when Britain left India, having been shamed by various left-wing Hasnamusses that it was India's time to take control of its own destiny. That hasn't happened. Evolution is very rare and should be cherished. The NGOs scatter around the second and third worlds money and technology and buildings, but it does not result in any evolution whatsoever in those people, because they didn't do it. Going around the world, in Zimbabwe, this week the government decided to kill and eat 200 elephants, because for them, 45 years after the British let go of control of that country, which had been Rhodesia, that government again can do nothing except slay and eat the elephants, if you can believe it. If we look in Latin America, it's a huge area on the map, but they seem to be doing nothing whatsoever. In fact, India didn't stay uncolonized for very long. Instead of the many elegant and regal buildings that the British made and that are still jewels, the American influence has caused various billionaires to build utter monstrosities, including this strange colonial house perched at the top of a skyscraper. All the class left when the British left, and India has not returned to some ancient Vedantic culture at all. The truth is that the British, having their own ancient culture, revered Vedantic culture and did not damage it, but the Americans after Nagasaki and Hiroshima have no ancient culture themselves, and so do not value anything in any country. There is a building boom at the moment in India. They're building temples. Here in Mayapur they're building a vast temple to Krishna that I'm interested in, but looking closely you can see it is just concrete pours. The same in Saudi, where billions are made constructing new mega hotels for the mass gathering of writhing Muslims, the esoteric heart of Islam, having drifted away from there a long time ago. Whilst I'm at it, I'll also talk about Central Park in New York. This must have been one of the most beautiful parks in the world, surrounded on four sides by elegant buildings. But not anymore. The Hasnamus billionaires have built these evil matchstick buildings and totally ruined one side of the park. You have to question the mentality of these fucking people. One thing about these matchstick buildings is that with any seismic activity, they wobble like hell, and in order to stop them collapsing, modern scientists have come to the rescue once again. At the very top of these tiny matchstick buildings, they hang huge weights, sometimes 1,000 tons, that means 1,000,000 kilograms, are suspended in the top 2 or 3 floors of this building. It's called a mass damper, and it stops the building vibrating so much. So you have these pencil-thin buildings looming high above over the streets of New York, and at the very top of these buildings are gigantic weights. What could go wrong? Of course, since ancient times, the wise simply moved away from people when they were like this, because there was nothing else to do but to step away from them. In previous times, there were those who were considered such Hasnamusses that separating their head from their shoulders was considered to be a mercy to them. The reason seems to be that the many eyes that create a false world and a totally distorted partial view of life are forming in the third story of human beings. And in the chaos that is in what people call the human mind, which is really the premature initiatory activity of the third story, there is no stability. And the solution is what is called religion, which is a support from above that gives you an image or a faith that holds together the third story so that you can develop into it. Because we are living beings, and evolution is trying to grow us just like it grows a house, story by story, until the roof is put on. Critical for Western people, they do not know how to do spiritual practice anymore because they relied on Catholicism for so many centuries, and it worked so well they just didn't need anything else. Gurdjieff spoke of higher bodies, 7 in all in fact, but in the first story there are 3 that we can be concerned with. There is the planetary body, there is the astral body, and there is the mental body that together form a 4th. He says, a new independent organism can grow in the planetary body, affording a much more convenient and responsive instrument for the activity of consciousness than the physical body. Recently I read something and I'm afraid I've lost it, perhaps somebody can help me out. Gurdjieff said something like, you should be able to move through space if you can channel the cosmic force of love, and of course that this higher type of moving coming from a higher dimension would once again going through the moving center. But Gurdjieff was indicating that that center is connected to the plane of spatial manifestation, and that higher forces could perhaps be channeled into that center to cause a higher ilk of movement to occur. Very interesting. A very interesting and perhaps very distant idea. Something else from Gurdjieff now. Here Gurdjieff talks about the centers. He says, and this happened because the sounds of their melodies, combined in a definite sequence, upon entering my common presence underwent jadklom, or to put it another way, the sounds were sorted out, and acted equally upon my clodistomaticules, or of all 3 sources, with the consequences that the associations in my three independent brains, coming from similar but differently natured series of impressions, although proceeding simultaneously and with an equal intensity, engendered in my presence three quite different promptings. For instance, the localization of my consciousness, or as your favourites would say, my thinking centre, engendered in my common presence, let us suppose, the impulse of joy. The second localization in me, or my feeling centre, engendered the impulse called sorrow. And the localizations of the body itself, or as once again your favourites would call it, my moving centre, engendered the impulse of religiousness. And it was just in these unaccustomed impulses, evoked in the beings by their instrumental and vocal melodies, that the learned members of that group indicated what they wished to transmit. A detail at the end, he says that the beings evoked them inside themselves and they were transmitted. And I noticed this week with some friends that if I started to sway around the campfire, that several of them would end up imitating me as if it had been transferred center to center. But the main thing for me is that the moving center can feel religiousness, and that I learned when I was being trained in yoga that religion is mainly physical and emotional. If you look at movement 39, you can see that quite clearly. If I try to decode a little bit more of Catholic practice into its esoteric action, kneeling causes you to submit to a higher knowledge that is transmitted to the moving center. I don't mean metaphorically. Your moving center receives it like that. The next thing is making the sign of the cross that Catholics like to do. Why do they do that? You see, I've started to understand that in all the ancient religions are actions. There are no dogma, there are no metaphors, everything is action, meaning they actually act on the substances of existence. I think I'll round off with one of Martin Benson's stories of a youth in a different time. Do you remember the classroom? I remember once being there once. I'd gone there for a long time. I was well behaved. We were never lectured. We had to sense the thing on our own. I thought later on that it made my sister keener and more acute in her development as a child. You couldn't say that these things were taken away from her. This was the life of the times. Children are not put on the spot that much these days. My sister was responsible. She felt her responsibility. That is what responsibility is. But I was self-sufficient from the moment I was born, I guess. I'd be on my own when I was 3. That's when I found my park. I walked alone for 6 or 8 blocks, and I found this park. I sensed it the way horses smell water. I found this big oak tree, and that was my tree. Once my sister found me there, she always knew where to look for me. I'd go there all the time. That was my tree, but it was always the natural forces, and I think I was born with that idea. The tree was always in my existence. Somewhere in my sensitivity the tree existed. And even in violent thunderstorms I couldn't understand why my sister would come for me and would have to run into our house. I couldn't understand that. Why not stay under the tree? That always amazed me. This was in Central Park in Brooklyn, I think. I used to just walk there, walk away often. It was probably 6 or 8 blocks away. I went like a bullet to that place. Years ago, no one ever stopped children. Now they stop children. I remember once she came because a terrible thunderstorm was coming. We were standing outside in a nice neighborhood, and the people hauled us in. It was one of those downpours. And then, after it stopped, we were soaking wet. We dried off, and they were terribly nice, and we went home. But I remember that. That registered on me. All kinds of impressions registered. There are times that can become dangerous. I was super sensitive, and I was sensitive to names. I sang as a child. I know I had a good voice. I was called Martin Caruso, and I had to live that down. There goes Martin Caruso, they'd say. That is agony. I was so goddamn embarrassed. That's what I mean. Sensitivity overcame me. I'd walk blocks out of my way to avoid seeing anybody who knew me. There was a boy years ago in those neighborhoods with a violin. He suffered, I'll tell you, because you were a sissy if you played the violin. The names, the nicknames that kids got from one another. Sometimes they stuck and sometimes they didn't. I was embarrassed all the time. I was that kind of crazy. Okay, we've arrived at the end again. Thanks for listening, and take care.
Spiritus Sancte Deus, miserere nobis. Sancta Trinitas Unus Deus, miserere nobis. Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis. Sancta Dei Genitris, ora pro nobis. Sancta Virgo Virginum, ora pro nobis. Sancti Michael, Gabriel et Raphael, ora pro nobis. Omnes Sancti Angeli, ora pro nobis. Sancte Abraham, ora pro nobis. Sancte Ioannes Baptista, ora pro nobis. Sancte Iosef, ora pro nobis. Omnes Sancte Patriarcha et Prophete, ora pro nobis. Sancte Petri et Paule, ora pro nobis. Sancte Andrea, ora pro nobis. Sancti Ioannes et Jacobe, ora pro nobis. Sancte Matei, ora pro nobis. Omnes Sancte Apostoli, ora pro nobis. Sancte Mache, ora pro nobis. Sancta Maria Magdalena, ora pro nobis. Omnes Sancti Discipuli Domini, ora pro nobis. Sancte Stefane, ora pro nobis. Sancte Ignasi, ora pro nobis. Sancte Polycarpe, ora pro nobis. Sancte Augustine, ora pro nobis, Sancte Laurentii, ora pro nobis, Sancta Agnes, ora pro nobis, omnes sancti martires, ora te pro nobis, Sancti Leo et Gregori, ora te pro nobis, Sancte Ambrosi, ora pro nobis, Sancte Augustine, ora pro nobis, Sancti Basili et Gregori, ora te pro nobis, Sancte Benedicte, ora pro nobis, Sancte Ioannes Maria, ora pro nobis, Sancta Teresia, ora pro nobis, Sancta Elisabeth, ora pro nobis, omnes sancti et sancte Dei, ora te pro nobis, propitios esto, libera nos Domine, ab omni malo, libera nos Domine, a morte perpetua, libera nos Domine, per incarnationem tua, libera nos Domine, per sanctam resurrectionem tua, libera nos Domine, per effusione Spiritus Sancti, libera nos Domine, Christe Filii Dei vivi, miserere nobis, qui nunc mundum venisti, miserere nobis, qui mortem propter nos accepisti, miserere nobis, qui a mortuis resurrexisti, miserere nobis, qui Spiritus Sancto in Apostolos misisti, miserere nobis, qui venturus es judicare vivos et mortuos, miserere nobis, o nobis pacas, te rogamus audimus, ut ecclesiam tua sancta, egere conservare generis, te rogamus audimus, ut omnes ad evangelii lumen peducere generis, te rogamus audimus, Christe audi nos, Christe audi nos, Christe exaudi nos, Christe exaudi nos, Ainos Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis, Ainos Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis, Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis, Christe audi nos, Christe audi nos, Christe exaudi nos, Christe exaudi